Record. I see a record light going. Is it recording? Can you tell?
Yes, it's recording.
All right, it's recording. I don't know. We'll see if it works. This is my Christmas present. So yay! We're starting a new Torah class, or the Torah class. So, all right. What is the Torah? I knew that'd be the question. So I gave you a whole bunch of good stuff. As a matter of fact, the goodness in this is, let's first of all talk about what we're going to study. Because, really, this is a Torah class, but we need to understand exactly what we're going at, right? And I hope this isn't, I'm not trying to, denigrate your previous knowledge, but I like to use, if you didn't notice, I like to go back and historically look back at the historical traces for everything that we're doing. So, when we look at Hebrews, we're looking at Greek culture. The Torah happens to be Jewish culture. So we've got to go back, we've got to look at Jewish culture. When we're talking about Greek culture in the first century, we're talking 2,000 years ago. We're talking about the Torah culture, the Jewish culture, we're talking about 3,500 years ago and further. So this is where we got to start. And I'm not going to... Why did we change all the terms? Like, what do we usually call the Torah? The Pentateuch, yeah. Why would we call it the Pentateuch?
Because that's Latin, right?
It's newer, it's fancier. Well, okay.
Church like the Latin.
I got a real problem with this. I hope you have the same problem. What's that?
Metric system.
Well, I got a problem with separating us from our Jewish culture. Don't you? Because our culture, the culture of Teen Hodos, is Jewish. It's a Jewish sect. Did you guys know that? You're a Jewish sect. That's what we are. And so if we separate ourselves from our Jewish culture, we just separate ourselves from Jesus. Yeshua is what Jesus' name is in Hebrew, in Aramaic. So let's start with the Torah. Torah, first of all, we can't start with the Torah, we have to start with the Tanakh. What is the Tanakh? The Tanakh, and that's what I've got right there, the Tanakh includes, the Tanakh is what we usually call, any guess? What do we usually call the Tanakh? The Old Testament. OT, Old Testament. The Jewish people call it the Tanakh. And in the Tanakh, there is the Torah. The Torah. And with the Torah is the first 5 books. And you notice I gave it to you in the Hebrew. I can't pronounce all those. I do Greek. I don't do Hebrew. I'll try to do the best Hebrew I can for you. But in the Torah, you have the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then you have 2 other parts. You have the Nebim, and the Ketuvim. And I think there's supposed to be slash in there. Anyway, Ketuvim. The Nebim is the prophets, the Ketuvim is the writings. And if you see, I've got a list there of the prophets. The prophets are grouped into the greater prophets, the lesser prophets, and the 12. Then there are Ketuvim. And by the way, anybody want to guess why, first of all, why is the Torah divided the way it is, and the Nebim and Ketuvim divided the way they are? Any guesses? Right? There is some hints. The hints there Esther on Purim? They're different festivals, but what is significant about those documents on those festivals? They read them, and that means they were a scroll. So the Torah is a scroll. So you can, you're not supposed to, but it is possible in history to find separate Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But that is not the way you'll find it in a synagogue. You will find in a synagogue always all 5 of those documents in a Torah scroll. Likewise, the greater prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, you'll always find in a single scroll. You'll find the lesser prophets, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, in a single scroll. You'll find the 12 prophets in a separate scroll. You'll find Psalms, Proverbs, and Job, usually in a same scroll. You'll find the Song of Solomon's on Passover over in a scroll. Ruth, the whole scroll is read on Shavuot. Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, each of these is a separate scroll. Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, they're usually found together. Anyone know what's significant about Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah? They're post-exilic, but they are written in Aramaic, mostly. Not all Aramaic, but they are partially Aramaic. All the rest are written in Hebrew. We're going to talk about Hebrew. It's a big deal. So, we have the Tanakh, which includes the Torah, the Nivim, and Ketuvim. These are the proper names of these documents. They are scrolls, and they always were scrolls, and they still always are scrolls. We just happen to have them as separate or as documents we put in the Old Testament. Now, the documents, I don't want you to ever forget. We have allowed society and allowed people to take these documents, and they think of the documents as a singular thing, right? The Old Testament is a singular thing in the minds of our culture, our society, and most people. They're not. These are documents, and I'll talk about the time of the documents, but these are documents written from 3,500 years ago to 400 BC, about 400 BC. That's longer than the United States has ever been around. That is longer than the age of novels. That is longer than almost the age of, not quite as long as the age of Christianity, but from a standpoint of age, it is enormous. And the differences between the Torah, which is the earliest documents, and the later documents, which probably the latest documents, well, we'll talk about that. Malachi, for example, the differences are stupendous because of language, because of culture, because of societies, because of a lot of different things in the world. And we'll talk about those. The other thing I want to mention is not in the Tanakh and not part of the Torah, but you can never, ever, ever speak about the Torah without speaking about the oral Torah. The oral Torah is the Mishnah. The Mishnah. Now, the oral Torah was never written down until someplace around 100 AD. The oral Torah was the province of the Pharisees. So the Sadducees were big time into the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nivim, Ketuvim. That's what they focused on. The Pharisees, on the other hand, and so this is a huge deal. When did the Pharisees become the Pharisees? When did they start doing their thing? Because the Pharisees are usually called, remember what they're usually called? What do we call Pharisees? They are rabbis. Yeah, the rabbinic group is the Pharisees. The Pharisees claim that the oral Torah was given by God, the Mishnah was given by God, to to Moses. And that Torah, that oral Torah, was passed down orally from Moses in every generation. Finally, around 100 AD, they wrote it down. And they wrote it down in what is called the Talmud. The Talmud includes the Mishnah. As a matter of fact, a Talmudic page, I think I'll bring you one. I didn't bring one today, but a Talmudic document in the Talmud, the page of the Talmud, the Mishnah is here. This is a page. The Mishnah is here. The Mishnah commentary, direct commentary from Hebrew is here. Here and here are the Talmudic commentaries on the Mishnah. And then around the edges are notes. These Talmudic commentaries and notes can be German, French. This is Hebrew. This is Hebrew and Aramaic. And then the comments are Hebrew, Aramaic, German, French. There's no English. They stopped adding to the Talmud approximately 1400 under what's his name? Rambam. Rambam in the 1400s was a Jewish rabbi, and at that time they kind of set the Talmud. So the Talmud has really not changed much since then. The Talmud's really cool because you get there is actually commentary from the unnamed one. Anybody know who the unnamed one is? They took away his name and gave him a number. They took away his name. Paul. Paul was a student of the Rabbi of Rabbis, Rabboni of Rabbonis, who was Gamaliel. And there's actually Paulian, they scratched his name out. But they left his arguments in because they were solid. Yeah, they're solid.
I have a question. I'm just confused about the whole Torah, oral Torah, Mishnah Talmud. So we have the Torah or the scrolls,
Yeah.
the 5 scrolls. So if that's the Torah, then wouldn't the oral Torah just be the same as the Torah, but it was verbal, not written? So why isn't the Mishnah the same as the Torah?
Well,
Is the Mishnah the commentary?
that's a great question. No, the Mishnah are added.
So when did we get the scroll? I guess I don't understand the Torah scrolls versus the written down oral of the oral. Does that make sense? I'm not trying to ask. Yeah, I don't know why there would be more.
Okay,
Sorry that I just.
that's actually a good question, but the answer is very odd. All right? The rabbis and everybody, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Zealots, and Teen Hodos would tell you, can you make changes to the Torah? No. Never. Never, ever. It's the written word of God. Period. The Mishnah explains, and we're going to get into this. Don't skip ahead too quickly, but we will get into the concept of the explanation of the law, because it's within the Torah. But the Mishnah explains further many of the points of the Torah. The Mishnah, you think the Mishnah can change? No, never. The Mishnah can't change. However, all the rulings in the Talmud are about the points in the Mishnah and the Torah. I'll try to give an example. We will see this. But in the Torah, for example, it says, you shall not walk a day's journey on the Shabbat, on Sabbath. On the Sabbath, you may not walk a day's journey. What is a day's journey? According to the Torah, it is what can be bounded, okay, a bounded area. According to the Mishnah, it is as long as you don't stop to eat. So, in the Talmud, they did two things. In the Talmud, number one, they put a rope all the way around Jerusalem, which meant that in Jerusalem, you could walk from one end of the city to the other, because it was a bounded area, without addressing the Shabbat. For the Mishnah, if you needed to go on a journey on Shabbat, you would send your servants ahead who were not Hebrew. And by the way, this is illegal, we know under law, we'll see that. But they would send their servants ahead with food. And the servants would stop at certain points and drop the food off, yes. And then you would travel to the food and pick it up and eat it. You didn't stop to eat, right? You didn't stop at an inn. You were able to keep continuing. It was a drive-through. Exactly. Right, exactly. So, the Mishnah allowed them, gave commentary basically on the Torah, which allowed them then to write the Talmudic documents, which were rulings on the Torah and Mishnah. So although the Torah was never supposed to change, what effectively happened? It changed the meaning. And this is what Jesus got so mad at. The Pharisees especially. The Sadducees were the guys who were big time in touch with the Torah, right? Sadducees priests. So Jesus wasn't quite as irritated at the Sadducees. He was irritated at the Sadducees for making a market of the sacrifice. And we'll talk about that when we get to sacrificial type stuff. But he was really mad at the Pharisees because the Pharisees had taken the law and basically commented the law out of existence. He had changed it radically. So, for example, when Jesus says, is it legal, for example, to pull an animal if your ox falls into a well? Is it legal to pull him out on Shabbat? What does the Talmud say? Yeah, the Talmud says, yeah, you can do that. Mary, the Talmud, we'll talk more about this stuff. It really gets deep. Do you know what? You have to fast on which of the fast? The fast. The required fast. If you don't fast on the fast, what does that mean? There's 36 things that are not forgivable in Judaism, and one of them is not fasting on the fast. Well, guess what? If you are ill, you may break the fast on the fast. That's not in the Torah. That comes from the Mishnah and the Talmud. But today, a Jewish person who is fasting, who becomes ill during a fast, may eat. Jesus was really, smart, not just smart. I guess I'll talk about this. This is kind of important. When a boy was 13 with pubic hair or a girl was 12 with pubic hair, that was a ruling. We'll get into this, why this is, when we talk about Genesis. We begin in Genesis in a couple of weeks. But that is when you did the bar mitzvah, and the women today do a bat mitzvah. What a boy did from the time he entered the synagogue school, and we're talking first century here, we'll talk about when that potentially started, but synagogue school, from about 5 or 6 until 12, they memorized the Torah. I'll get into that in more detail, but they memorized the Torah. I'll talk about why that's critical. When they were 12, or 13, when a boy was 13 and he did his bar mitzvah, he basically would read from the Torah. That was his indication of adulthood. If he was considered skilled and went on in his education, he then would go to memorize the Nevi'im and Ketuvim. I guess I have to talk about this. Okay. The way that our educational system is way different than the educational system or the system that the Hebrews had. It's very different than the Greeks to a degree too, but we're more like Greeks. We are Greek thinkers and Greek doers. The Hebrews, the way this worked is when you went, and it's astounding how people learn. They would go to a synagogue school, and the boys would sit usually behind the rabbi with the scroll. And the rabbi would point, there's a pointlet, and it's called a tefich. I think it's tefich. It's a pointer. You can buy it. They pointed to each of and they're backwards, it goes backwards, at each of the letters, and they would pronounce the letters, the words, and they would memorize them. And they did this every every day from, 5, 6 until 12 years old, until they memorized the entire Torah. They didn't ask questions. They did not answer questions. There were no questions to be answered. Why were there no questions to be answered?
Point of the exercise.
That isn't the point. Plus, there isn't anything to add or subtract from the Torah. The Torah is the Torah. So if you're learning the Torah, are there any questions? No. It's the Torah. You just learn it. Period. That's it. So you would learn this by over and over and over again hearing the rabbi read it to you until you memorized every single word of it. And then, if after your bar mitzvah you were considered to be educated, that rabbi would then promote you, so to speak. He would tell you, okay, you're not that good, but you're a pretty good scholar. I want you to go to Barak over here in Tipsit. You can go to Tipsit Barak. He's a rabbi. He's about your level. You're okay. You're Paul. Gamaliel. You got to go to Gamaliel. How about Jesus? Jesus, according to the thing, Jesus was recommended to Gamaliel. Basically recommended to Jerusalem. Remember we did the Archgo documents, and in it, it says that his rabbi recommended him to further training, but he didn't. Interesting. But anyway, so if you were really good, they would recommend you to a rabbi. And what you do is you go to that rabbi's house, and you would sit in the circle of the rabbinic guys, usually behind the rabbi. The pictures are always wrong. The people sitting in front of a teacher, that is what kind of style of teaching? Well, Greek. It's Greek. That's the Greek style. In a Hebrew style, you always sat behind the rabbi so that you could see the scroll. And the guys who were in bad shape were the ones who were further off and couldn't see the scroll very well. Hopefully your eyes were really good. But you would go to that rabbi's house, and the rabbi would invite you in. Now, we don't know what kind of tests they give, but the test they probably gave, what do you think the test was? Probably reciting the Torah. You probably they wanted you to recite the Torah in a meaningful fashion. Not adding, if you added and subtracted, what would happen? You're done. Sorry, bye. The thing is, they wouldn't feed you. If they didn't give you a place to lay down your head or feed you, then you were done. That meant go home. So, there would probably be some kind of test. They would ask you to read a part of the Torah or recite a part of the Torah, and then if you missed even a single beat, you're done. That's it. But you would then begin to memorize the Nevim and Ketuvim. After you've memorized all the Nevim and Ketuvim, if you were under a rabbi, which most of the time they were up to that period, then you would begin to memorize the Mishnah. The Mishnah was oral, so the only way you could get the Mishnah was from the rabbi. The Talmud was oral for a long time, so the only way to get the Talmud was from the rabbi. The Talmud is the only thing they would add to. And there were no questions asked, and this gets kind of complicated. But if you had a group of rabbis who were fully educated, memorized the Torah, memorized the Nevim, Ketuvim, memorized the Mishnah, and memorized every word of the Talmud, and they're sitting around together, now they're in a circle, because they're all equal. They're sitting in an equal circle. And one of the rabbis makes a comment. He quotes from the end of the Talmudic argument. The Talmudic arguments, I've got the Talmud. I don't think I have the full Talmud. It's this big on a shelf, and the books are this big each. And they would end with a Talmudic argument. La, 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 la. Alakiyawa said that in this case, a woman caught in adultery would be required to do so and so and so. And the next guy would say something. And if everybody thought it was intelligent, they might say, we agree. If they didn't, they're like, you're out of there. They go to the next guy. And each man would make a comment. Each rabbi would make a comment. And if there was an addition to the Talmud, they would memorize it. and they would send it out with runners to each of the synagogues, so they would know. That's why. How do we know this? And they were really good about it, because there is a Jerusalem Talmud and there is a Babylonian Talmud. There's two Talmuds we know of, and they're both pretty close. They're pretty close to one another, which means they were keeping pretty good track through memory. Maybe better track through memory than other things. But anyway, so this is the basis where we're starting. We're starting with the Torah. We have all these things, but what I need to really talk to you about is this. Language is critical. Language is critical. This isn't English. We have our English translation, but it's not English. It's Hebrew. And Hebrew is very similar to Aramaic. Hebrew died out, was a dead language in 100 AD. The reason it was a dead language, and when I say dead language, you know what a dead language is, right? You know what that means? It's not commonly spoken colloquially. It is only used in certain circumstances. And the other problem with the dead language is it's not a changing language. Now that could be good or bad. The dead languages today, one of the chief ones we know about is Latin, right? People used to study Latin. They should study Latin, but Latin is a dead language. The language is no longer changing. It's not spoken colloquial by anyone. No country speaks Latin anymore. So it's called a dead language. Hebrew was an unchanging language. What was the antecedent with Hebrew? What was the language? What language is Hebrew closest to in the world? I gave you a hint already. Aramaic. Aramaic. Now, this is what happened. Hebrew, and this is one of the big differences with the language. Okay, and why in Hebrew, and before what I did, when I did this class, I gave you the Hebrew language. There are no vowels in Hebrew. No vowels at all. So, let's pretend I'm writing Hebrew. What is this? Pot, cat, cut. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Or this. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Now, other languages, as a matter of fact, anyone have an idea where Hebrew possibly came from as a language? Yeah, children of Israel, remember they went to Egypt for a long time? The children of Israel could not write prior to going to Egypt. When they came out of Egypt, they were able to write. And so they were probably writing, and I guess I get a little detail, that the Egyptians did hieroglyphics in rock and stone. They did not do hieroglyphics on papyrus, on pottery, which they also wrote on. They used Hieratic and Socratic script. And it's a scripted language, and it looks very similar to Hebrew. The Hebrew language, however, was definitely changed. Remember, they moved from Israel, and I'm giving you a history here, but they moved from Egypt back to the Israel area. And what did they write in Israel area? Does anyone know? Cuneiform. The cuneiform, right? Cuneiform, take a little Socratic script and mix it with cuneiform, and you get Hebrew script. But Hebrew, what they did in Egyptian is you would have a form, you would have a consonant, and then you would have a determinant. So I'm just making up something here, but if that's an eyeball, then this means it's a physical eye, right? If I put a determinant of a man, then that means it's a physical eyeball, as opposed to it could be, I see you. Egyptian, early languages, especially Egyptian hieroglyphics and Egyptian Suratic script, is rhombics. Rhombics? A rhombic. I love you. I heart you. Right? Rebus. Yeah, ribbons. Rebus. Rubik's. Anyway, that's the way the Egyptian writing is. That's why it was so hard to determine. Hebrew is not. Hebrew is constant. And they go backwards, and there are no determinants. There are no determinants in Hebrew script. So the question is, number one, this means that the Torah scrolls are what? They're mnemonic devices for the purpose of remembering exactly what the script is. They don't include the vowels, and they don't need to include the vowels. As a matter of fact, the vowels were added from the Aramaic. The Aramaic, they took the scripted vowels from the Arabic language into Aramaic and into Hebrew in about 800 AD. And the Masoretes did that. I don't know if you ever heard of the Masoretes. I know I'm covering a lot of stuff, but this is historical stuff we need to understand. The Masoretes added the pointlets, the vowel pointlets, to Hebrew. So a vowel pointlet would be like this. That means it's a cat, and that means it's a hit, right? That provided the added information, which meant you could now read the scrolls without memorization. Unfortunately, you can't do that. Why? In a synagogue, what does a Torah scroll look like today? The same as it looked like 3,500 years ago. And this is, keep that in mind, because we're going to talk about veracity next week. And if you keep this in mind, this is really important. There is a reason why the rabbis did that, or that the priests and rabbis did that. But they're mnemonics. You don't memorize the vowels because you have memorized the text. This will get to be very important when we get to the point of when the Torah was given by God to Moses, and we get into that point. But this is kind of a detailed thing.
So when you say they had to memorize, they really weren't just sitting there in a chair looking out and just going word from word saying the whole Bible. They would sit down in the scrolls and they could read the scrolls. They knew what was missing. They knew that the A was missing in that particular, because they always had the scroll in front of them while they were reading it.
Yeah, they're supposed to. They're supposed to, because if you got it wrong, that was taboo. That's bad, right? If you're reciting the Torah, you better recite it perfectly, right? And so the reason that you had it written was so you did that. But the other problem that I need to mention is, in the scrolls, not only did they not have any vowels, they didn't have any paragraphs, any spaces between the words, any sentences, no punctuation, nothing. It's just consonant, consonant. But they're all mnemonics. To us, we read, and the way we're able to read is we have vowels, we have spaces, we have breaks, right? We have all these great things. And by the way, all these were added to your Bible. It's not the original. If you were Hebrew, you would memorize the text. Now, people use it. Did I bring one with me? I have a Masoretic Bible. I need to load up my Old Testament stuff. I have a Masoretic Bible, a Masoretic Old Testament. And it has the pointlets. It's illegal for you to bring that into a synagogue. You can use it for study, but you can't use it in a synagogue. You can't read from it. That's anathema. You can't do that. You have to read from the Torah, and you have to read, without pointlets, without, and by the way, okay, to help you read, beside you in the synagogue are two gentlemen. And the two gentlemen have memorized everything, and you're with the pointlet, and their purpose is what? What do you think? Make sure you don't make a mistake, but what else? They'll give you a hint, but there's more than that. What's that? Well, it's pretty heavy. I mean, it takes two men pretty much to carry a scroll. You always see the pictures of, no, they're heavy. Well, make sure. What about, okay, what do we want with punctuation, with exclamation points, with question marks, with the expression? Exactly. As a matter of fact, one of the biggest what's the biggest problem with writing that the people in the ancient world would say is a problem with modern writing, with modern books? Yeah. You need determinants. You need emojis to tell you. You should have a smiley face by the smiling ones and a frowny face by the frowny ones. When you read the Torah, they don't expect you just to read every single word. If you read every single word in monotony like this, it would go, no, you're missing the point, right? When something is sad, you're supposed to read it sadly, and the phrasing, right? The sentences, the phrasing, when it's a question, you're supposed to put the question. And by the way, what have we lost? We hope that when our lectors are reading the documents correctly, right? And I told you, those are Greek and Hebrew. If they didn't have punctuation, what did they add? Phrases, punctuation, paragraphs. What if they're wrong? What if the translators were wrong? And I'm not trying to question translators. I just want you to know how difficult this is. This is a very complex thing. Translating from one language to another, and especially expression ideas. Because Hebrew is not English. Not at all. It's a very simple language, very sparse number of words. It is very similar to other ancient languages. Grammar is key. I've already told you about all these things. No punctuation, no paragraphs, no spaces, no breaks. Written from right to left in horizontal lines. There are different forms. Here's another one. How many numerals are in Hebrew? Zero. What do they use? Do you see a problem with that? What's the problem? Exactly. How do you know it's not part of a word? That's why, over time, right? These are memorized. So if you don't have your helpers or your rabbi or people who've memorized that language and those words and those numbers, you could have a serious problem. As a matter of fact, today in Hebrew, Hebrew is no longer a dead language. Hebrew is used by Israel as their language. It's colloquially used today. What did they do to fix the numeral issue? They use Arabic numerals. They use the same numerals we do. So they said, forget that. That doesn't work. They also use pointlets. So they did the Masoretic pointlets.
So Lionel, when did it become alive again?
It became alive again in 1948. In 1948, Jewish people decided to basically say Hebrew is the language of Israel. When Israel became a state, and they began teaching it as a language. So it is different than Aramaic, but it is very similar. As a matter of fact, okay, this is a problem. What do you think the pronunciation of the words is today?
Whatever somebody decided in 1948.
Yeah, it's Aramaic. They use Aramaic pronunciations because nobody knew what word. As a matter of fact, okay, I'll tell you the story, Yahweh. No one knows how to correctly pronounce Yahweh. Yahweh is the name of God. It means I am in Hebrew, but it's the name of God. And the biggest problem is, okay, we know this from Josephus. Just before before the time of Jesus, Josephus wrote, and Josephus was not living in that time. He was living past that time, but he wrote that according to the histories and the analects of the Jews, he wrote that the high priest would say the 118th Psalm. In the 118th Psalm, at the very end it says, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of Yahweh." And he is supposed to, from the very beginning of time, he would say that loudly, because what was supposed to happen after he said that? The Messiah was supposed to stand up and announce himself. And we know from Josephus that he would say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of..." Nobody knew how to say it. That's why when they went to get Jesus, and if you remember John, Jesus stood up and he said, "I'm the way," right? "I'm the water of life," etc., etc. He said that in John when the high priest said those statements. Well, when they went to get Jesus, what did he say? "Who are you looking for?" "We're looking for Jesus of Nazareth." And he goes, "I am," ego imi, in the Greek, which meant that he said, "Most likely," and they all fell down. So he probably said Yahweh. He probably said the name of God when he said that. It's just has been, the reason it's not transliterated as the name of God was what? Yeah, the commandment is not to not curse the name of God. You know, we've got this thing about, we're going to learn about the commandments, all right? The commandment that we're used to, don't take the name of the Lord in vain. That's not what it says. According to the Jews, it says, "Thou shalt not say the name of God." And so the Jewish people, especially in the first century, but even before that, to even state the name of God was considered sacrilege. The high priest didn't want to say it, probably because he couldn't pronounce her correctly, but also because saying the name of, it's the only time that they said the name of God in public, ever. Even though, and by the way, well, I'll get into this later. There's other things. So, Hebrew is different. Hebrew is also very much like English in that it is a very euphemistic language. What does euphemistic mean? I love my cat. I love my wife. I love my kids. I love my dog. I love my pizza. Really? The Greeks have a different word for each of those types of love. And most people wouldn't say in foreign languages they love pizza. That's really a strange connotation. What do you mean? You mean, romantically? Do you mean, from a, what do you mean, right? But in English, that's a euphemistic, we have euphemisms like crazy. We also have the broadest vocabulary of any language in the history of the world, 1 million words, but we barely use about 20,000. Most ancient languages are about 20,000 words, and there are ones that are concrete like Greek, and then there are ones that are euphemistic, very euphemistic, like Hebrew and Japanese. So Hebrew is a super euphemistic language. What do I mean by that? The elf, I don't know how to write an elf, A-L-F, elf in Hebrew means ox, friend, lover, associate, one. What's that?
That is your tactical.
That is my tactical. But it has a bazillion meanings. And if you look at some of the Psalms, and we studied Psalms before, and we studied one that started without. And I said, well, what does it mean? Well, anyone who knows poetry, what does it mean in poetry? All of those things, right? You have to look at the context. And sometimes the context, what do poets do all the time? They mess up the context on purpose because they want you to take multiple meanings from it. And guess what? Hebrew is wonderful that way. It is multiple contexts. It's very difficult unless you're a Hebrew speaker or you talk to the rabbis, or usually we look at LXX. What's LXX? Yeah, the Septuagint is the translation in about 275 BC of the Torah and the Tanakh, the whole Tanakh. And so we are Greek thinkers. So if you go look at the LXX, which is a Greek translation by the Hebrew scholars, that gives you the ability to see, at least in 275 BC, what they thought the meanings of the words were, which may not be the meanings that they were written as, nor the meanings that we may translate them as. But we'll get into that. I'm not trying to help you question translations. I'm just trying to help you understand. This is a complex subject and something that's worth looking at very deeply, right? And so, if anything, I don't want you to question stuff. I want you to say, wow, this is exciting. We need to look at this because it's different, right? It's something important. There's another thing we need to look at, that is this. English versus Greek versus, and I guess I'll mention the Greek as passing. In English, how do we write in English? How are you supposed to write in English? Well, I mean, in terms of...
Intro, body, conclusion.
Yeah, intro, body, I should say that better, right? We write English in intro, body, and conclusion. You know, this is the way we are trained to write in English. And there's another society that's trained. Remember, we got it from that other society, the Romans. The Romans write this way. This is not the way ancient Greek is written. Ancient Greek is always written. Greek is always logos to unstated telos. A logos to an unstated telos. And what does that mean? I'm not going to go into details. It's okay. That's what Greek is, always. That's why it's hard to understand sometimes in New Testament documents. Hebrew is, anybody? Synopsis body. Synopsis body. I have to give examples. All right, you ever heard the so-called educated professors who tell you there are 2 creation accounts? You heard that? How about there are 2 accounts of Noah? There are. When we look at Noah, we'll see there's 2 accounts of Noah. But they always love to say there's 2 creation accounts. Why?
Because they think that it undermines the creation account because if there's 2 different ones, they disagree and it's not real.
What it shows is, if anyone says that, it means they are basically uneducated and foolish. Because the Hebrew is always written in synopsis body. That is the way they write it. That's the way they write their ancient language. Period.
So the synopsis can last chapters and chapters.
The synopsis can be relatively long, it can be relatively short. Sometimes it's as short as 2 verses or 2 statements. But it can be long. It could be extremely long. It can be like, the synopsis body of the creation account is about a chapter long for the first part, right? And then the second goes into detail. But that's the way it works, synopsis body, which the most important thing to remember about that is, what are the 10 commandments? Synopsis of the law. As a matter of fact, they say it, don't they? What is a synopsis of the law? It's the 10 commandments. And there is even another synopsis of the law that's... Yeah. There is a synopsis of the synopsis. This is very Hebrew. Hebrew loves this. Now, I don't believe that. I'm not into the modern Hebrew scholarship. I think almost the whole world has gone to the intro, body, conclusion, because that's the way, technical papers, everything's written pretty much in our world. But ancient Hebrew is always synopsis body, so that's just something you need to look at. If you don't understand it in synopsis body, what happens?
You take another meaning out of it, or you think it's not really history, or it's made up, or
And all the rabbis go, what's wrong with you? You've got these professors that are in school that are telling the Well, why didn't you talk to your rabbi? Oh, they don't have a rabbi. Oh, anyway, most of them don't believe in God, but that's okay. Anyway, the thing that you have to understand is that the language is different. The language is there are complexities to this. There are differences, and this is what the Torah, the Tanakh, and the documents are all about. The writing is a different style, and so we will look at that. We'll see how that works together. The other things that we need to kind of talk about culture, I told you, we're spanning a culture from hunter-gatherers to a complex society. You see domestication of animals, shepherds, domestication of plants, agrarian societies, beginning of learning and writing, the beginnings of mechanization, the inventions of the seven machines, metallurgy. We are going from basically the Stone Age to the agrarian age. And so, do you think there's changes? There's huge changes. There's huge changes in ways of thought. We'll talk about Hebrew society and culture at the time. How about this? How do you tell time? How do you tell sunrise, sunset? Whoa. Well, how do I know what a year is? A lunar? How do I know what a lunar year is? Well, there's lunar years. There's lunar years, sidereal years, and there's, did you know that? There's 3 types of years. Solar years, sidereal years, lunar years. Which do you use? Well, I use a calendar. It's,
Use my phone. Yeah.
whatever the phone says, right? Well, how do you know? I mean, if you're a culture, did they have calendars? No? Did they have Apple Watches? No. So how do you know what time it is? How do you know what day it is?
Sundial.
Oh, okay. The phase of the moon. Well, still, how do you know? You know?
Yeah.
And so every village had one person whose responsibility was to keep track of the time.
Probably. Well, cycle of festivals, the lunar, okay, and there's also another way to tell time, ladies. Yeah. This is not this, culturally, okay. Women were able to tell time over long periods through lunar cycle because guess what? They have a lunar cycle, and so it's very interesting because you find it in cultures. This Saxon culture really uses it a lot in time telling. Hebraic culture, not as much. I was going to talk a little more about time telling when we talk about that next week. But the time, for example, time of day. Who invented the time of day? You know when? 1300 BC was invented by the Egyptians. The Egyptians are the ones who gave us the 24-hour clock. They didn't do it on purpose. They had 10 hours of daylight and 2 hours of twilight on either end. And so they made a sundial that would be 10. They wanted 10. That's nice, right? Base 10. And then they added the 2 hours of twilight because they weren't really daylight. The children of Israel left Egypt in about 1500 BC or so, 1500 BC. They weren't there for the invention of the sundial. How do you know what time of day it is? Well, even then, what time? I mean, you know when the sun rises, you know when the sun's overhead, you know when the sun sets. Water clocks were Babylonians, and water clocks about, let's see, 300 BC. 300 BC, approximately Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism needed clocks because in Zoroastrianism, the temple sacrifices were done on time basis. In Zoroastrianism, in the Babylonians. But before that, months. Where do you think months came from? Yeah, but who invented the months? Any idea? Yeah, the Babylonians. The little Babylonians, after 586 BC. How do we know that? Because the destruction of the first temple was in 586 BC approximately, and we know the Babylonian documents didn't get to us. But guess what we have? the Old Testament documents in the Ketuvim tell us about the Babylonian times, and at that time it talks about the Babylonian months. So we know by about 586 BC that the Babylonians had months. There were 12 lunar months, each of them 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3.5 seconds. No, they didn't know that, but we do. That meant that each day, each lunar month had to be 29 or 30 days, but the problem with that is you have leap issues. You have real leap issues.
Second Adar.
There are issues. Matter of fact, you had to add months. They had a whole month, yeah, to the calendar. Hours, minutes, and seconds came from we've mentioned it, it's Babylonians. In 300 BC, they invented the ability to do hours, minutes, and seconds. And, okay, you have to do, time is up! We'll continue. I've planned for 2 semesters or 2 trimesters of this class, unless we move quicker than that. But that will give us more time. What's that? 6 years. Well, we did the Hebrews in 3 years, but I'm not going to translate every single piece. But just keep in mind, as you think about this, we'll look at veracity next week, but just keep in mind the differences between what we know today and what they knew